Hello, Year 13. I made this revision session and I delivered it earlier, recorded it for you all, but of course it crashed and failed to save, so I'm doing it again. This time I'm going to divide it into two sections to make sure that the file's not too big. In the first section, I'm going to cover biography, looking at Seamus Heaney's life, then look at the socio-political context, then look at the publication context and look at 4 different anthologies that we're studying. Then I'll move on to form and structure, then a few previous questions, and then in the second video, I will move on to the comparators, which will be the real meat of the revision session and the thing that I think you need most for tomorrow. Briefly, beginning with the biographical section. Heaney was born in 1939 in County Derry. In a relatively integrated community, he had Protestant neighbours and they were on friendly terms, he says. However, there was always a sectarian difference between them. His family, as I said, were Catholic. His father came from a small holding farming life. He was a well-known cattle dealer and he travelled a great deal. His mother came from service, so she had direct experience of the Protestant gentry and he knew about them from her. The farm was Mossbourne Farm, as I say, a small holding where he has very, very vivid memories. Perhaps the most important moment in his life is when he wins a scholarship to go and study at St. Columb's College, where he studies Latin and Irish as well as English literature and develops a great love of literature, mythology and history. Later, when he leaves school, he moves on to study Anglo-Saxon at Queen's College, and this will be an important part of his work. We know that Heaney is obsessed by language and is very interested in the Gaelic language, in the English older language. He uses Anglo-Norman words too, and as I say, he's a brilliant classical literary scholar. In 1957, Heaney has a real epiphany kind of moment when he reads Ted Hughes's poem Lupercal. I think Ted Hughes is worth knowing about as an intertextual reference because Hughes often sees the violence in nature. And I think that Heaney sees the potential for using nature for allegory. And nature is going to become a way in which he can discuss vicariously the troubles in Ireland, the cycles of violence that we'll see. In 1963, he joins the Belfast Poets, which are a big influence on him. He's writing a lot about Belfast, and at this stage, the civil rights movement starts to become very strong in Belfast. In the United States, the civil rights movement was for African American people looking for their rights, looking for equality. In Ireland, it was Catholic people who tended to be poorer and not in the armed forces and not in the police force. Another seminal moment in his life is 1970, and when we look at the poem Westering today, we'll talk about this. This is when he travels to California to Berkeley University as a visiting lecturer. In the 1970s, following violence, he moves to Dublin. A lot of people criticize him for this, and they see it as a kind of act of betrayal, or at least an act of retreat, and that's something we can talk about as we go through his work. In 1972, he gets a position with Harvard University. And then after that, later, he moves on to Oxford later in the 1980s. That goes beyond our timeline, but it is interesting because it shows his brilliance as a lecturer, also just how well-traveled he becomes, how global he becomes, but at the same time, how focused he remains on Ireland in particular. Now, in terms of the context, the big themes that I think we need to be able to talk about are imperialism, and that often takes the form of rape and murder. I'm going to jump to this point here, the Aisling vision. This was a convention in Gaelic and Irish poetry of having a spirit or a vision return from the dead who would talk to you like a kind of prophetic figure. And in many cases, this was a woman. And Heaney uses this to produce this idea of the kind of rape of Ireland, the violation of Ireland by the British. And I think that that's something that we see in quite a few of the poems, most notably in Act of Union, perhaps the most magnificent of the poems. He's very interested in linguistic and cultural resistance, and we see in poems like Anahorish and New Song. He's very interested in naming, again, Anahorish, and the idea of translating and mapping. One of his best friends was the brilliant Irish playwright Brian Friel, who wrote a play that was very influential called Translations, all about how the English tried to wipe out Irish place names and remap Ireland into a colonial province. Of course, we know that he's very interested in Viking and Norman invasions, and that's going to feature very heavily in North. He's very interested in the bog bodies, because constantly in his work he's looking for some kind of index to discuss the troubles, something in history that would kind of illuminate what is happening in the present. And that takes him into the whole idea of pagan cruelty, etc. In many ways he dismantles the difference between the Christian Ireland and the pagan Ireland, and instead he shows a lot of continuity. And this produces a kind of cyclical view of history that we see in particular in the poem North and throughout the collection of North. Now, moving on. Now, I spoke a little bit about the troubles in Ireland. When they first begin, and Heaney starts writing his first poems in Death of a Naturalist, he uses the pen name, the nom de plume incertus, uncertain in Latin. And it shows a certain kind of ambiguity that Heaney has in his work that makes many of the Irish nationalists very critical of him. He's most certainly a nationalist, and he writes against the imperial project, and he writes for the rediscovery of Irish culture, but he has an ambiguous attitude towards violence and tribalism. And this is what generates quite a lot of resentment, quite a lot of criticism of him. A key moment is Bloody Sunday 1972, when the British armed forces opened fire on unarmed Irish protesters. There's a lot of discussion about those particular events, but the general sense is that this was a massacre of protesters. As I said before, he gets criticism from Sinn Féin for not being political enough, especially following things like direct rule and internment. Direct rule is that the Irish government was ruled directly from Westminster, so it seemed incredibly imperialistic. And in terms of internment, this is when people are locked up without there being sufficient evidence to keep them, to convict them in court. So that seems rather authoritarian to many and a complete violation of civil rights. Heaney moves from Belfast in 1972, just as the IRA's mainland bomb campaign begins. They begin to bomb targets in England, and this is followed by the killings and abductions of ordinary people for sectarian reasons. And in 1975, tragically, his second cousin, Colin McCartney, is abducted and killed, and these are people who left in unmarked graves. So this is where the bog bodies come in. It seems to me to be a wonderful kind of parallel that he's able to explore and able to look back in history. Heaney famously says you should never separate politics and history. And we also see in poems like Punishment a kind of a reflection on the tar and feathering of women who've had relationships with British soldiers. Okay. Finally, I want to discuss as well the influence of mythology. Again, if we're looking at it from a sort of hard nationalist point of view, and when people are kind of colonial and post-colonial poets like Heaney, they do actually often have to choose sides, and Heaney found this very difficult. He was steeped, as I said, in mythological literature. He loved Dante. He loved, Greek mythology, Latin, which he knew very well, and of course Norse mythology he knew, and Saxon mythology. Later he's going to translate Beowulf. So he's absolutely saturated in mythology, and we can see this coming across in his work, particularly in Personal Helicon, where he writes about Narcissus. It's a very interesting poem. I'm going to say a bit more about that later, about the role of art and the role of the imagination, about whether this is a kind of form of escapism, or whether it can be a retreat to a place where one could become more reflective. Of course, in the brilliant poem Tomb Road, he also writes about the Omphalos, or the center stone of the Oracle of Delphi, which he interestingly relocates from Greece to Ireland. Now, in terms of the publication timeline, in 1966, his first work is Death of a Naturalist, and that's where we have Personal Helicon and Midterm Break, which, tragically gives a beautiful account of the death of his young brother. In Door into the Dark, which is 1969, Requiem for the Croppies, Bogland, Peninsula, Croppies, Wintering Out, Croppies, all of these occur in that particular anthology. In 1972, having returned from America, he publishes Wintering Out. And in this one, we have Anna Horish, the beautiful poem celebrating the Irish identity and language, Westering, the curious poem that ends Wintering Out, which really isn't about the West or about the United States at all, but more about Donegal and more about the Troubles. The Tolland Man, another beautiful poem, a New Song, which is a remarkably different poem that celebrates again a kind of rebirth of Irish identity and the linguistic richness of the landscape. In North, following Bloody Sunday, following Interment and Direct Rule, the tone darkens significantly, and we have the poems North, Punishment. I put there Big Queen. I'll just quickly change that to Bog Queen. Punishment, Act of Union, and the Groibel Man. So we have a much darker tone here. He takes a deep dive into the bog bodies and really gives us a highly evocative picture of this pagan world of punishment, which I think we see, most vividly in the poem Punishment, which links to the present in Ireland, to the tar and feathering of women, and to his reflections upon his role as an artist. The final work that we have a poem from is Fieldwork, which is published in 1979. By this stage, he's well and truly living now in the South, and this is the poem Tomb Road that I mentioned earlier. Now, in terms of themes, this is by no means a comprehensive account, but this will simply give you some ideas. I'm grouping together desolation, sorrow, grief, and suffering, and I'm thinking of the poems Midterm Break, Punishment, both of which are bleak poems with no sense of hope, the finality of death, etc., and contrasting those with Croppies, where we do have a sense of rebirth or regeneration, and New Song, where the landscape itself rebels against the walls and enclosures that go back to Anglo-Norman times. They break out, flow out. It's as though the landscape is reclaimed. In terms of pain, violence, trauma, and death, I'm thinking of the poems Westering, North, The Groibel Man, and Act of Union. And so all of those are very traumatic, dark accounts of grief, of suffering, particularly Act of Union. And perhaps on the other side, once again, New Song, where the landscape seems to rebel, where there is this kind of collective memory of Irishness that seems to be flooding out to this kind of sense of hope of the nation reuniting, rediscovering itself. And Anna Horish, where the Irish place names seem to have a kind of magical quality for Heaney. In terms of resistance, hope, and the future, I'm thinking New Song, Anna Horish, Peninsula, and Bogland, all of which offer a kind of vision for the future. And then the poem Punishment that doesn't, and North, in which the poet has to retreat into words in order to escape this terrible cycle of violence that seems to extend right back into history. In terms of memory, history, myth, and rediscovery, again, I'm thinking New Song, Personal Helicon, Bogland, and Tomb Road, all of which seem to have some sense of, history moving on, or the power of myth, and the idea of the rich past. And contrasting with that, I've got Peninsula and New Song, where you really have this kind of sense of the possibilities of tomorrow. Just take that R off and Peninsula there. Okay, now in terms of rebirth and regeneration, New Song, which I've described already, Croppies, which ends with the barley growing out of the dead Vinegar Hill rebels' pockets, and offering these kind of green shoots, a sense of the symbolism of promise and regeneration. And Bog Queen, where there is a kind of rebirth and regeneration, which I'll go on to discuss later, but it's a kind of monstrous kind of Frankenstein's monster return of the repressed, so very dark. Now, in terms of active union, there is going to be a kind of engendering and a birth, but it's a kind of Rosemary's Baby, unwanted pregnancy, terrible kind of allegory of what the North, and the Protestant North in particular, has become. And of course, the opposite of rebirth and regeneration is midterm break, where the box or coffin shows the finality of a young life cut short so cruelly of Heaney's brother. Imagination, creativity, writing. We've got personal helicon, where it's an ambiguous look at writing in some ways. I think Peninsula as well, where we have this idea of creative space and rediscovering your voice. And then we have Westering. I'll talk a lot more about that. And I think the other one there would be Punishment, where he very disturbingly refers to himself and to the act of writing as a form of voyeurism, which I find very interesting. Now, in terms of love, sexuality, gendering, and the feminine, we've got the Irish land being raped in active union. We have the young adulteress in Punishment being tortured and killed in a barbaric way for her sexuality. And we have Bog Queen, which is kind of rendered as a sexual assault and a return of the repressed narrative that I'll talk about more. And then in New Song, we have this flowing, erotic kind of love in which the landscape and sexuality and femininity come together. And we also have the Toland Man as well, which I will describe a little bit more. Now, I thought it would be wise as well to remind you that in terms of poetry in particular, you need to cover form and structure. So you want to look at poetic voice, you want to look at who's speaking, what voice are they using, what tone of voice they use. Is it first or second person? Are there perspective shifts, which you often get in Heaney's poetry, as I mentioned just a moment ago in terms of Punishment, where he moves from complete empathy and watching the torturing of this adulteress as though it's before him, to reflections upon his work as an artist in the present and his own political positions. So these perspective shifts are very important. Apostrophe is when you actually address somebody. So he uses apostrophe in Punishment, for instance. And many of his poems are dramatic monologue, where the I becomes the imaginary person. And this gives him the ability to engage in intense empathy and draw parallels between the past and the present. Almost all of Heaney's work is quatrains. Nearly all of the poems you'll see are 4-line quatrains. He loves short lines. He seldom uses tercets. He uses them in midterm break, I think partly to show this incredible act of self-discipline, that his grief is so raw that he uses these tercets, these shorter lines and these controlled caesures to kind of contain his grief. Now, it's very important that we look at a jamon. I think Heaney's sense of rhythm is magnificent in his poems, and I will try and draw your attention to that when I look at a few. Heaney is very interested in the sonnet form, which, you know, from Petrarch was a love poem form. He particularly is very good at using the volta, where he will change the perspective or darken the tone. And this can be very effectively done. You don't only need to talk about volta in connection to sonnets. You can use it in terms of all verse forms. He's very good, Heaney, at using delaying structures. What do I mean by that? He withholds information so that there's a little bit of an enigma, and then he gives it to us later. If we look at the poem Anahorish, it's only midway that he tells us that Anahorish is this place of, before that he tells us a place of clear water. And he gives us this list of qualities so that it kind of builds up a little bit of suspense, a little bit of enigma. He is wonderful in terms of verbal patterning, one of the great poets. And rather than using rhyme very often, some of his poetry almost reads like free verse, and you might miss how carefully verbally patterned it is, using assonance, using alliteration, using consonants, and using very, very effective evocative onomatopoeic language. So you'll notice that he uses plosives very carefully. He'll use patterns of liquids, the L sounds, and of aspirants, or the F fricatives, or the sibilant, the S sounds, or the nasals, the M's and N's. So look for this, particularly in the Nain poem, which will be before you, and you could talk about how he creates this kind of musicality and rhythm. Now, of course, he's very interested in the idea, and he talks about the Irish language and the English language, both of which coexist in him. After all, even though he would, in terms of his national identity and his idea of his kind of soul language, English is his first language, and he doesn't really write very much in Irish, although he knows Irish and studies Irish poetry. So he refers to the Irish as vowels and the English as consonants. And he refers to producing vocables, which is a kind of blend of these. And I spoke earlier about him using all of his linguistic knowledge to blend Saxon and Norman and some Norse words and Irish words. So he's incredibly interested in the vernacular. But he'll often shift from the vernacular to the epic or the mythical, as we see in a poem like Personal Helicon, which in some ways is a very vernacular poem about wells, etc. You know, very quotidian every day, but then he gives things an epic dimension by even using a title, Personal Helicon. Anybody who knows that this is the place of the muses, etc., will know that he's elevating the importance of this. Big feature of Irish literature, often used by James Joyce, who will elevate a scene in a cold Dublin street by giving it a kind of classical dimension, by shifting diction, by giving it a kind of grandeur. Now, he also likes to use synesthesia. I won't say too much about that now because I'll do it as I go through the poems. Personification, zoomorphism, where he takes on humans taking on animal characteristics, and chromomorphism, where humans take on just substance attributes. We see that particularly in the bog body poems, where there are all sorts of similes that he uses to show the peculiarity of flesh and this kind of transformation that has happened to human bodies by crusting in the earth and changing. Now, I've said a little bit about allegory, symbolism, and juxtaposition. These are all very important in his poems. Allegory, as I say, is often to do with the fact that he'll find parallels with the past. Symbolism, particularly Christian symbolism, or the symbolism of rape that we've seen, and juxtaposition when he puts startlingly different things against one another so that we can see the contrasts, yeah. And very importantly, as I said before, time frames and the blending of time to problematize the idea of the present and show that it is not unique. Now, very quickly, this will be the last thing that I do in this video. So far, in terms of the Oxford AQA, we've had human suffering with Requiem for the Croppies named. We've had a no-named poem, Consider the Significance of Place Names, but you'd probably most certainly be looking at Anahorish there. Quite difficult to think beyond that particular one. Heaney's locations are presented as apparently barren but rich in meaning. You've all done this one before, and you know bogland very well. Now, I'll never say that bogland is it won't come up again, but it's unlikely to come up again in the near future. This is a good one. Heaney spoke of the need to acknowledge the lostness and unhappiness of home. You'd most certainly be wanting to look at westering. Punishment ends with that sentiment, so that would be a very good one. And to what extent do you agree that Heaney's poetry is more concerned with landscape than with people? And you should begin with Peninsula, which is very much would be a pro that point of view, and you'd have to look at perhaps a different one, like Anahorish, where the people do seem to be part of the landscape to provide you with the counter argument that you may be looking for. And finally, Heaney's focus on place tells us more about the distant past. This is one that I would most certainly think you should all think about, because it extends beyond this question and will be integrated into all questions on Heaney. So, We've looked at, let's just very quickly sum up what we've done there. We've looked at biography, we've looked at the socio-political context, we've looked at the publication context, themes, form and structure, and some of the previous questions. I'm going to stop now, and then I'm going to move on to the comparatives. I hope that that was useful.